Hello, this is Coding Gicha for full-stack developers. Once you've completed the development of your web application, you need a server to host it. If you don't have the resources to set up your own server, you can use services like VPS from a web hosting company. With a web hosting company, you can receive server management support, and depending on the specifications, the cost can be lower. Let's set up a web service environment on a VPS from a web hosting company. The operating system for the VPS I'll be discussing is Ubuntu server. You can connect to a remote server running Linux via SSH. While Windows requires a GUI environment due to its limitations in working with a CLI environment alone, Linux allows for complete, easy, and fast work with just a CLI environment. Using the uppercase X option enables X11 forwarding. This allows you to share the local system clipboard with the remote server and run GUI applications installed on the remote server. Since most work on servers requires root privileges, web hosting providers sometimes create root accounts for you, but some only create regular accounts. If only regular accounts have been created and you want to add a root account, you can set a password for the root account. However, the root account does not allow SSH logins. If you allow SSH logins for the root account and restart the SSH service for the changes to take effect, you can connect to the remote server as root. When you connect to the remote server, you will be notified that updates are required. Before upgrading the packages, I will update the registered repositories. I will check the packages to be upgraded. I will upgrade the packages. While a reboot is not required after the upgrade is complete, I will reboot before starting the actual service. Rebooting will restart the remote server and automatically disconnect the SSH connection. It may take some time for the remote server to reboot, so it's best to connect via SSH with some extra time. Before connecting via SSH again, let's first configure the SSH client environment. Each time you connect via SSH, you'll need to add options and login information, so you can configure this information in advance. I'll enable SSH access only with the host name, and the remaining information will be automatically reflected as preset information for each host name. Now, simply add the hostname to the end of the command when connecting via SSH. Let's check the server's time zone. You can set the desired time zone regardless of where the server is installed. Personally, I recommend setting it to etc. UTC rather than your locale. Since I frequently need to edit configuration files, a text editor in a CLI environment is important. I prefer Vim. Since I have X11 forward enabled, I'll install Vim GTK3, which allows me to share the system clipboard. I'll set Vim GTK3 as my default text editor. Vim allows you to customize your configuration. I'll install Vimy, which manages Vim's configuration as a Git server repository. Installing Vimy is as simple as downloading it to the specified path. As of 2025, the latest official version of Vimy is 2.5. Vimy 2.6 is scheduled for official release in the first half of 2026. Vimy 2.6 will feature significant improvements over Vimy 2.5, and a separate Vimy 2.6-RC version is available. I'll download Vimy 2.6-RC. I'll grant Vimy executable permissions. Running Vimy init or Vimy I will immediately set the Vim configuration managed by the Git server repository. If you use multiple accounts on the Git server under the same domain, authentication issues may arise. Specifying the username before the domain address will prevent conflicts. Personally, I prefer to register accounts locally rather than globally, even though it's inconvenient. If you want to configure globally, you can omit the username and email address. Since the remote server can be accessed by users with various color themes, I'll use a one server template for the .vimrc file, which supports both dark and light themes. Since Vim packages are installed according to pre-configured settings, it may take some time. Upgraded packages are distinguished by their icon and color, rather than the information managed in the Git repository. In the CLI environment, you'll most likely use the ls command along with the text editor. I'll install lsd, which allows you to view file lists more powerfully than ls. It adds color and icon display options to the file list, and also displays file sizes in units. After downloading the deb installation file, you'll need to transfer it to the remote server using a file transfer application, so copy the link address. I'll download it directly from the remote server using wget. I'll install lsd using the deb file. I'll remove the downloaded lsd file. LSD's configuration is managed in the .config/lsd directory. LSD's default color theme is optimized for dark, making it less readable in light themes. Since the server must accommodate a variety of users, I'll configure it to accommodate both dark and light themes. I'll configure it based on the solarized light theme. I'll copy the link address again this time. I'll download the solarized light theme configuration file from the remote server using wget. The custom color theme must be a colors.yaml file. I'll edit the solarized light theme to work with the dark theme. The user and group colors display well regardless of the theme, but the red and yellow tones create a strong contrast, so I'll change both to yellow tones. Colors in the 230s are too dark to be visible in the dark theme, so I'll comment them out. The older date color is a bit dark, so I'll lighten it a bit to make it more visible in the dark theme. I'll comment out colors in the 235s. You can customize the config.yaml file to your personal preference. I'll copy my personal preferences from the coding Gicha site. When connecting to the remote server via SSH, I enabled the X11 forward option, and since I installed Vim GTK3 on the remote server, I can use the system clipboard with unnamed plus in Vim on the remote server. The color theme must be set to custom for the settings in the colors.yaml file to be reflected. The date format will be based on the ISO format with the day of the week added between the date and time. I'll set the directory to be displayed first. Running LSD instead of ls will allow for a more powerful file list view. LSD icons use font glyphs from Nerd fonts, which must be installed on the local client with the terminal emulator installed, not on the remote server. Some users connecting to the remote server may not have Nerd fonts installed, but since the icons are only slightly broken, I'll maintain the icon display. Let's open the .bashrc file with Vim. Thanks to Vimy, I can use Vim with the Vim configuration already set. By default, Ubuntu displays the prompt in color, but some applications' built-in terminals or the root account don't display it in color. Enabling Force Color prompt can resolve this. The prompt is set to begin with username at hostname, and the hostname displayed in the prompt displays only the first level of words separated by dots. Here, the hostname is set to gurum without a dot, so the last letters of the host name are not truncated. However, if you use a domain name as the host name, such as gurum.org, the last letters will be truncated. Let's change the host name to gurum.org. The changed host name will take effect the next time you reconnect to the remote server. To display the entire host name without truncating the last letter of the dot, use a \H. In fact, before recording the video, I had already set the value to gurum.org in the panel provided by the web hosting company. However, considering that the characters after the dot are truncated on the remote server, the web hosting company seems to have implemented it so that the values entered through the panel are truncated. This seems like unnecessary over-friendliness. If you set ls as an alias for LSD, then running ls or double L will launch LSD. Some clients may connect from environments that don't support ANSI colors. For this case, I'll configure the ls to display directories first. I'll add a bash shell function that loads a session file that sets the Vim's terminal to run exclusively. You can work with multiple terminals without installing a separate terminal multiplexer like tmux by setting the Vim's terminal to run exclusively and then saving it as a session. I'll immediately apply the settings to the .bashrc file. Even for the root account, the prompt is displayed in color, but the changed host name will not be reflected until you reconnect to the remote server. Setting up the remote server environment took some time. Now, let's move on to building a web server to serve the web application. On a Linux server, mariadb can be easily installed via a repository. If you install from the repository provided by Ubuntu server, a somewhat older version of mariadb will be installed. However, by registering and installing the mariadb repository, you can install the latest version of mariadb. Let's select the Ubuntu distribution you're using. Ubuntu 24.04 FS code name is Noble. MariaDB 12.1 is still in the RC version, but installing from a repository will ensure continuous updates. Therefore, I'll install 12.1 here. I'll accept the default repository mirror address. Scrolling down the screen will show installation instructions for the repository based on your selected settings. You can install by copying and pasting it into the remote server's command line, but here I'll type it in directly and copy only the settings for the apt sources file from coding Gicha. You'll need to install curl and a package that allows the package manager to access data and packages via HTTPS. I'll install them using apt. Let's create a directory to download the mariadb-PGP key. I'll download the mariadb-PGP key using curl. There are two ways to register the MariaDB repository: multi-line apt format and single-line apt format. I'll paste the multi-line apt format copied from the coding Gicha site. I recommend setting the architecture to AMD64. The 32-bit OS architecture has been removed. If you don't set the OS architecture, apt will attempt to update repositories for the 32-bit OS architecture every time you update, resulting in warning that it failed. I'll update the file to reflect the added repository. Let's install the MariaDB server. Once the installation is complete, you need to run the mariadb-secure-installation command. Since there's no root password yet, press enter. You'll be asked whether to authenticate using Unix socket authentication. I'll enter N. If you choose Unix socket authentication, authentication will be performed when the operating system login user is the root account. Note that starting with MariaDB 10.4, if the operating system login user is the root account, authentication will be performed using Unix socket authentication, regardless of the configuration. This means that the MariaDB root account password will be used only when the operating system login user is not the root account. Enter a new password. Enter the same password again. Configure the remaining settings as appropriate for your environment. I'll install the Nginx as my web server. The Apache HTTP server suffers from the C10K problem, so the modern Nginx web server is more popular these days. While the Apache HTTP server doesn't yet have plans to support HTTP 3, Nginx is quickly supporting new features. If you install Nginx using the default repository provided with Ubuntu 24.04, Nginx 1.24 will be installed. However, since Nginx 1.25 supports HTTP 3, you'll need to register an additional repository. However, in this example, I'll install the default repository provided with Ubuntu 24.04. Serving web applications with TLS security certificates has become essential these days. I'll install Let's Encrypt, which provides free certificate issuance. Certificates issued by Let's Encrypt are guaranteed to be trusted because they are linked to a properly certified intermediary and a root CA. When issuing a certificate using Let's Encrypt, ports 80 and 433 are used internally, so you must stop the web server before requesting the certificate. I will issue a TLS certificate using Let's Encrypt. Simply enter the domain you wish to issue the certificate to after the D option. If this is your first time running the tool, you will need to configure and agree to a few settings. I will enter my email address to receive urgent renewal and security notifications. I agree to register as an Acme server. I will be asked to share my email address with the Let's Encrypt project partner. I will decline to agree. Let's Encrypt allows you to issue certificates for free. However, to increase reliability, they are issued with a short validity period of 90 days. Therefore, you must frequently renew them. Certificates can only be issued from servers where the domain is registered and operational in DNS. Therefore, wildcard domains cannot be registered in principle. To issue a wildcard domain, you must enter the issued code in real time in the DNS.txt record, and the newly issued code must be updated in real time with each renewal. Therefore, it's practically impossible to set up automatic certificate renewal. Now that the certificate has been issued, let's start the web server. Let's navigate to the path where the certificate file is stored. Let's check the generated certificate files. The certificate files will be created in the directory named in the first D option. Let's write a script to automatically renew the certificate. I'll also copy the script from coding Gicha. Since renewing a certificate requires the web server to be stopped, I can minimize stop by configuring it to only attempt renewal if the month of the renewal attempt is different from the month of the certificate renewal. I'm only comparing months because I'll be scheduling the cron job to run on a specific day every 2 months. I'll grant it execution permissions. Let's Encrypt. Certificates have a 90-day validity period and can be renewed starting 30 days before expiration. Therefore, they will be renewed every 2 months. However, if renewal fails due to conflicting renewal dates or other reasons, I will schedule renewal attempts every week during that month. Since November is coming up soon, I'll schedule the certificate renewal to attempt every odd-numbered month and every Monday at 2:30 a.m. Since a month is approximately 4 weeks, I've implemented a safety feature to allow for 3 or 4 additional attempts if the certificate fails to renew on the first Monday. Providing dynamic web services requires a server programming language such as PHP or Java. Nginx integrates with PHP via the fast CGI interface. php-fpm must be installed. Most languages install modules through their respective package managers and manage them within project management tools. However, PHP typically installs modules through the system package manager, requiring a PT to install PHP modules. When connecting to MariaDB in PHP, you must also install php-mysql via a PT. I'll also install some PHP modules that I personally recommend. The curl, zip-gd, and mb-string modules are not only recommended but are also almost essential for PHP development. Therefore, they are usually installed before development. Let's configure the PHP environment. I'll set the file path for error logging. If you're implementing a file upload feature, you'll need to set an appropriate upload size. Of course, the web server must also set the maximum request body size. Even if multilingual support isn't supported, the nature of web applications allows access from various locations. Therefore, setting the time zone to UTC, etc. may be preferable. You can easily display results in your local time zone using the time zone option. Let's create a directory where PHP logs will be written and set the account ownership to www data. Let's restart php-fpm. I'll install OpenJDK 25, the current LTS version. If you have multiple versions of OpenJDK installed, you can specify the desired version using update alternatives. Currently only one version is installed, but you can check the Java installation path. The path is automatically set after installation, so it's ready to use. However, some applications implemented in Java or using Java require a Java home directory to run. Therefore, I'll set the Java home directory. This will take effect after re-logging in, but I'll apply it directly to the same shell using the source command. Java requires compilation, so I develop with a project manager like Gradle. Since the server only deploys the completed development results, a separate project manager is not necessary. Instead, a WAS such as Apache Tomcat is required. If you develop with Spring Boot, you don't need WAS, and even when developing a Gicha.org-based application, you don't need WAS because you develop it using Gradle plugins, but when deploying even Spring Boot-based web applications are sometimes served on WAS to apply multiple domains, etc. I'll download Tomcat 11. Tomcat 11 is based on Gicha.org 11 and supports Servlet 6.1. Copy the download link for Apache Tomcat. Create a directory to install Tomcat and navigate to it. I'll download Tomcat using wget. I'll unzip it. I'll delete the downloaded compressed file. Since I unzipped it into the Tomcat directory, I'll rename the unzipped directory to a version-specific name. This will be useful for referencing the previous version or reverting to a previous version when upgrading Tomcat to a later version. Changing versions can be made easier by creating a symbolic link to the version you're using, such as current. Since I are only using one version here and the explanation could be lengthy and confusing, I'll skip the symbolic linking. I'll register the Tomcat service in systemd. I'll also copy the Tomcat service settings from the coding Gicha site. The Tomcat service execution user and group are recommended to be Tomcat. However, if more privileges are required, you can change them to root. The Java version should match the installed OpenJDK, which is the same version used here. If the Tomcat version is different, you'll also need to fix it. As mentioned earlier, if you created a symbolic link, you won't need to fix the service file even if the Tomcat version changes. To reflect the added Tomcat service, I'll reload the daemon. I'll enable the Tomcat service. I'll start the Tomcat service. I'll check the status of the Tomcat service. When you connect via SSH, the messages initially displayed are messages from the MOTD. While the default MOTD messages for Ubuntu server are quite useful, I'll make them more visual and readable. I'll install SYSstat. SYSstat is a Linux performance measurement tool. I'll write a script that uses SYSstat to visually display server information. The Coding Gicha website has an example of displaying information in my preferred format. I'll copy it. I'll paste the copied script. The MOTD messages will be displayed in order of file name with executable permissions among the shell scripts in the update MOTD directory. I'll grant execute permissions to the newly created shell script. I'll remove execute permissions from shell scripts that display unnecessary information. I'll disconnect from the remote server. I'll reconnect to the remote server via SSH. The default prompt only displays the first word of a host name that contains a dot, but now the entire host name is displayed. The MOTD messages have also been updated to be more visual and readable. Thank you for watching.